At 9:17 on a Tuesday night, my cousin asked me a question that split my life into before and after. "Lauren, is Nathan really in San Diego?" It wasn't what she said. It was how she said his name. Careful, measured, like someone stepping around broken glass in bare feet. I told her yes. He had left that morning for a fintech conference. 3 days? Investor panels. Networking dinners. The kind of trip he'd taken a dozen times before. I could still picture him at the airport, rolling his carry-on with that calm, confident stride that made people trust him instantly. She didn't respond right away, because 10 minutes earlier, she had personally checked my husband into the presidential villa at the Monarch Crown Resort in Phoenix, under the name Evan Cole. She said he smiled when he handed over his real driver's license, then casually requested that the reservation remain under the alias for privacy. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look rushed. He looked relaxed, polished, like a man who believed his plan was flawlessly arranged. Like no one in that building could possibly recognize him. But the hotel manager on duty that night was my cousin, and she had stood next to me on my wedding day. After the first shock passed, something stranger settled in. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even ask the question most wives would ask first. I asked, who was he meeting? Olivia hesitated. Not a woman, she said. 2 men. Late 40s. Maybe early 50s. One of them carried a leather briefcase. The other looked like he owned half the room. That answer shifted everything. If this were an affair, I could have wrapped my anger around it. Affairs are ugly, but they are simple. Betrayal, desire, weakness. I would have known where to put the blame. But 2 men in tailored suits inside a luxury villa for 3 hours. That felt deliberate. He requested no electronic service entries during the meeting window, Olivia added quietly. No staff interruptions. No automated room logs. That detail lingered longer than anything else. When I hung up, the house felt too quiet. The television was still on, muted. Some news anchor moving her lips in the background. I stared at the blank reflection in the dark screen and tried to steady my breathing. Nathan Whitmore, my husband of 9 years, co-founder of a rapidly rising fintech company in Scottsdale. Charismatic, strategic, generous at church fundraisers. The kind of man investors trusted with their money and neighbors trusted with their children. The kind of man who had been gently encouraging me to simplify my grandmother's inheritance trust over the past year. My grandmother Eleanor passed 18 months ago. She left the majority of her estate in a structured trust that would transfer full control to me when I turned 35. 4 months from now. Nathan always called it our future. He'd suggested we streamline oversight, consolidate advisors, optimize tax exposure. He'd said it so often that I'd stopped noticing how frequently he used the word we when talking about something that legally belonged to me. I opened my laptop and logged into the trust portal. The dashboard loaded slowly, as if it too was hesitating. Administrative review in progress. I blinked at the notification. That hadn't been there yesterday. I clicked into the document center. A recent amendment was listed. Filed 3 weeks ago. I opened it. A temporary financial oversight advisor had been added in the event of beneficiary vulnerability. The name attached to that clause was Charles Whitmore. My father. I scrolled further. The justification language referenced concerns raised by spouse regarding beneficiaries' impulsive investment tendencies. Impulsive. I have never made a single independent investment decision without formal review. My portfolio has been conservative since college. I felt a small crack form in the center of my chest. I searched my inbox for correspondence from the estate attorney. Over the last 6 months, Nathan had been copied on nearly every message. My father had replied to several threads. In 2 instances, I wasn't included in the follow-up conversation at all. A calendar entry from 2 months ago caught my eye. Capacity discussion. My name was in the subject line. I tried to remember that week. I remembered a dinner. Nathan gently telling me I seemed overwhelmed lately. My father nodding, saying I carried stress differently than most people. I had laughed it off. Now the laughter felt misplaced. I checked my personal checking account next. A pending hold appeared on a 5-figure transfer I had initiated last week to diversify into a separate investment account. Status: pending verification of capacity. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Capacity. The same word again. My phone buzzed. It was Olivia. She had sent a scan of the villa registration form. Under purpose of stay, one word had been handwritten. Consultation. Beneath the alias Evan Cole was a signature. It looked like Nathan's. Confident. Fluid. But something about the angle of the final letter felt slightly off. Not enough to scream forgery. Just enough to whisper intention. I stared at that signature longer than I meant to. This might not be about another woman. It might be about control. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the couch with my laptop balanced on my knees, refreshing the trust portal every few minutes like it might confess something if I stared at it long enough. The house felt different. Not unsafe. Just rearranged in a way I couldn't see yet. At 10:43, my phone buzzed. Long day. Early meetings tomorrow. Miss you. Nathan. The timestamp glowed against the dark. If Olivia was right. He had sent that message while inside the presidential villa in Phoenix. While meeting lawyers. While discussing something important enough to hide behind a different last name. I didn't respond. Instead, I clicked back into the trust dashboard. Administrative review in progress. The phrase sat there like a quiet accusation. I opened the amendment filed 3 weeks ago and read it again slowly. A clause had been inserted under emergency provisions. In the event of beneficiary vulnerability, a temporary oversight advisor could be appointed to safeguard assets. The name listed was Charles Whitmore. My father. There was a justification paragraph attached. It referenced recent concerns expressed by spouse regarding beneficiaries' inconsistent financial decision-making. Inconsistent. The word felt carefully chosen. Neutral enough to sound reasonable. Damaging enough to raise doubt. I searched through older email threads between me, the estate attorney, and the trust administrator. Over the past 6 months, Nathan had increasingly been included in correspondence. At first it made sense. We were married. Transparency felt normal. But then I noticed something else. In 2 separate threads, my father had replied all to the attorney with follow-up questions. In both cases, I had not been copied on the responses that came after. My stomach tightened. I clicked into the calendar history attached to the trust portal. 2 months ago, there was a meeting labeled Capacity Discussion. The attendees were listed as the estate attorney, my father, and Nathan. I had never been invited. A memory surfaced without permission. 3 months ago at dinner, Nathan had reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You've been under a lot of pressure," he'd said gently. "Maybe we should simplify the trust structure so you don't have to carry everything." My father had nodded. "It's not about control, sweetheart. It's about stability." I had smiled and changed the subject. Now that memory didn't feel supportive. It felt rehearsed. I opened the transaction history. My viewing access remained intact, but the editing privileges tab was grayed out. Transfer requests were restricted pending review. Administrative authority had been temporarily reassigned. The effective date matched the day Nathan had handed me a routine tax adjustment form to sign before he left for what he said was San Diego. I pulled up the PDF of that form from my email archive. The document number didn't match any standard tax filing code I recognized. A thin, cold line of understanding slid through me. I switched tabs and logged into my personal checking account. A 5-figure transfer I had initiated the previous week was marked as pending hold. Status: pending verification of capacity. There it was again. Capacity. As if the word had been quietly circulating around me for months, attaching itself to conversations I had dismissed. My phone rang late the next morning. It was my father. His voice sounded unusually soft. Controlled. "I wanted to check in," he said. "Nathan mentioned you've been feeling overwhelmed about the trust." I let the silence stretch. "I'm not overwhelmed," I said finally. "Well," he continued carefully, Sometimes it's hard to see stress in ourselves. Adding temporary oversight isn't a punishment. It's protection. Protection. Protection from what? I asked. He paused. From volatility. From making decisions under pressure. I haven't made any volatile decisions. He ignored that. If the family consolidates oversight temporarily, everything stays stable until things settle. Family consolidates oversight. The phrasing made my pulse steady instead of race. What instability are you referring to? I asked. He shifted the conversation immediately. Asked about dinner next week. Mentioned the weather. Then said he had another call and hung up. I went back to the trust portal. Under activity history, a new document had appeared. Petition for temporary protective oversight. Status. Pending submission to probate court. The supporting rationale was attached as a draft. It cited observable stress patterns, difficulty processing large-scale financial exposure, and expressed hesitation in exercising beneficiary authority. Each sentence sounded clinical, detached. The supporting statement referenced commentary from my spouse, from my father. My throat felt dry, but my hands remained steady on the keyboard. If granted, temporary oversight would legally shift management authority over my inheritance to a joint supervisory structure, Nathan and my father, together. I leaned back slowly in my chair. This wasn't about another woman. This wasn't even about embarrassment. This was about positioning. If I were declared financially vulnerable before my 35th birthday, full control of my grandmother's trust could be redirected under the guise of protection. And if that happened, reversing it would not be simple. My phone buzzed again. Olivia. He wasn't alone in that suite. She texted. One of the men signed a confidentiality addendum. I recognized the name. She sent it. The name belonged to a probate litigation attorney known for high-asset guardianship cases. I stared at the screen for a long time. Nathan hadn't rented a luxury villa for romance. He had rented it to plan how to manage my inheritance without me. I told Nathan I was driving to Phoenix for lunch with a friend. He barely looked up from his phone when I said it. Just nodded. Distracted. Already halfway into whatever email he was typing. The normalcy of it almost impressed me. If he was nervous, he hid it well. The monarch crown rose out of the desert like polished glass and controlled ambition. I had attended charity galas there before. I had never imagined walking in as a quiet investigator of my own marriage. Olivia met me in her office instead of the lobby. She locked the door before she spoke. He specifically requested no electronic service entries during the meeting window, she said without preamble. No automated room access logs from housekeeping. No incidental staff movement. That wasn't romantic discretion. That was strategic privacy. She pulled up the internal reservation record. 3-hour block. Private dining cleared from the room. Conference-style seating arranged. No champagne. No anniversaire décor. This wasn't an affair, I said quietly. No, she agreed. It wasn't. She showed me the security sign-in log. 2 guests had entered the property and signed under their real names. One was the probate litigation attorney whose name she had texted me the night before. The other was a financial restructuring consultant I recognized from a quick search that morning. He specialized in asset shielding during high-net-worth disputes. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. They weren't improvising. They were executing. Do you know what they discussed? I asked. Olivia hesitated. I didn't intend to overhear anything. But when I brought a document for signature, the door was open for a moment. She looked at me carefully before continuing. I heard the attorney say, "Once temporary oversight is granted, long-term control becomes much easier." The room felt smaller. And I asked. Your dad replied, "She won't fight it. She hates conflict." The words landed harder than I expected. She won't fight it. Nathan had answered next. Olivia said. By the time she realizes, he'd told them. The court order will already be in place. I closed my eyes for a second. This wasn't speculation anymore. It was choreography. Did they sign anything? I asked. Yes. A confidentiality agreement for private legal consultation. It shields the details of their meeting unless subpoenaed. So they had anticipated resistance. They had prepared for exposure. Olivia turned her monitor toward me and opened the lobby security footage. Nathan appeared on the screen, walking through the marble entryway with that same easy confidence he carried everywhere. He shook the attorney's hand like a peer, not a nervous husband sneaking around. 10 minutes later, my father walked into frame. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look hesitant. He looked like he belonged there. I watched the three of them disappear toward the elevators together. For years, I had thought of my marriage as something built on shared goals. Now I was watching it from outside, like a case study. Was there notarization? I asked quietly. Olivia nodded. He paid an additional fee for expedited document notarization inside the villa. My stomach tightened. Do you know what document? I don't have content access. But the notary log references your name? I had not been in Phoenix that day. The date of that meeting matched the date on the suspicious consent form attached to the oversight petition. I pulled up the scan on my phone and compared it with the timestamp Olivia showed me from the notary record. Same day. Same window of time. Different city. I thought about the tax form Nathan had handed me weeks earlier. The way he had stood at the kitchen counter, pen ready, saying it was routine. How easy it would have been to digitize a clean signature from that form. Overlay it. Attach it. File it. They're trying to question my capacity, I said slowly. Before I turned 35. Olivia didn't respond, but she didn't need to. Full control of my grandmother's trust would transfer to me on my birthday. If temporary oversight were granted before then, the narrative would shift. I wouldn't be the beneficiary stepping into authority. I would be the unstable daughter under supervision. Keep everything, I told her. Every record, every log. I will, she said. As long as it's legal. I slipped the printed sign-in sheet into my bag. My father's signature was there. So was Nathan's. Under purpose of meeting. 3 typed words sat like a verdict. Capacity evaluation strategy. I walked out of the hotel into the harsh Arizona sunlight, feeling something settle inside me. This was never about protecting me. This was about positioning themselves between me and my inheritance. They weren't preparing paperwork for my benefit. They were preparing to prove that I couldn't be trusted with my own life. The certified envelope arrived 2 days later. Nathan was still in San Diego. I signed for it at the front door. The weight of the paper inside heavier than it should have been. The return address listed a probate litigation firm in Phoenix. The same firm from the villa. I didn't open it right away. I walked to the kitchen, placed it flat on the counter, and stared at it like it might rearrange itself if I gave it enough time. Then I tore it open. Petition for temporary protective oversight of beneficiary assets. My name appeared in bold at the top of the first page. The language was calm. Clinical? It stated that recent concerns had arisen regarding my financial stability and decision-making capacity in relation to high-value trust assets. It cited supporting testimony from my spouse and a family advisor. The family advisor was listed as Charles Whitmore. My father. The petition requested that the court temporarily assign financial control of my inheritance trust to a joint supervisory structure. Nathan and my father. Together. Attached behind the petition was a scanned document labeled Acknowledgement of Temporary Oversight. My name was printed neatly beneath the body text. And below it, a signature. Mina. Except it wasn't. It looked right at first glance. The slope of the first letter. The curve at the end. But something about the pressure pattern was wrong. Slightly flattened. As if it had been placed instead of written. The date beside the signature matched the day Nathan had asked me to sign that routine tax adjustment form before leaving for San Diego. I pulled the physical tax form from the drawer where I had tossed it weeks earlier. I laid both documents side by side. The positioning of the signature on the consent document matched the alignment from the tax form almost perfectly. Same angle, same spacing. But the consent document's metadata, listed faintly at the bottom, showed a creation date nearly 2 weeks after I had signed the tax form. My throat tightened. They had extracted my signature. They had layered it onto a new document. This wasn't just manipulation. It was forgery. That evening, my father showed up unannounced. He walked into the house like he still belonged there. Like he hadn't just tried to reposition my entire financial future behind my back. "I wanted to explain before this escalates," he said, standing near the kitchen island. "Explain what?" I asked. "That this is protective. Nathan is worried." "We all are." "Worried about what?" He sighed, as if I were the difficult one. "You've seemed stressed. Emotional. The scale of the inheritance is significant. Sometimes oversight isn't about control. It's about stability. Did you know about the signature?" I asked. He hesitated. "It's procedural." "That's not an answer." He shifted his weight. The attorney handled documentation logistics. There it was. Distance. Deflection. "Why is there a psychological capacity evaluation scheduled in my name?" I asked. He froze. "It's just standard due diligence," he said finally. "I never consented to that." "Well," he replied carefully, "refusing it might raise concerns in court." So that was the trap. If I cooperated, I validated their claim that oversight was reasonable. If I refused, I looked unstable. I stared at him across the counter and saw something I hadn't seen before. Not a father protecting his daughter. A man protecting his investments. "Is this about your real estate projects?" I asked quietly. His jaw tightened. "What does that have to do with anything?" "I checked public filings," I said. "Your downtown development is facing refinancing pressure." Silence filled the space between us. "If the trust assets are managed correctly," he said slowly, "everyone benefits. Everyone. Including him." After he left, I called Nathan. He answered on the third ring. "I received the petition," I said. A pause. "Just slightly too long." "It's temporary," he said smoothly. "You know how stressed you've been lately." "I've been stressed because my access was restricted without my knowledge." "That's just administrative timing." "And the signature—" Another pause. "You signed the tax form," he said. The consent language was aligned with it. Aligned. Like we were discussing formatting. "If everything is legitimate," I said quietly. "You won't mind forensic review." His tone shifted. "Escalating this will only make you look worse." "Lauren." There it was. Not guilt. Threat. After we hung up, I photographed every page of the petition. I scanned the original tax form. I saved screenshots of the trust activity log showing the reduced access and pending court submission. I wasn't panicking anymore. I was documenting. I searched for a fiduciary litigation attorney specializing in beneficiary defense and booked the earliest consultation available for the next morning. As the house fell silent again, I stood in the kitchen with the paperwork spread in front of me. My marriage no longer felt like a relationship. It felt like a coordinated strategy session I had never been invited to attend. They thought I would panic. Instead, I started building my own case. Margaret Hale did not look impressed when I finished explaining everything. She sat across from me in her downtown Phoenix office, hands folded neatly on the desk, eyes sharp and steady, mid-50s, silver at her temples. No unnecessary sympathy in her expression. "They moved too early," she said. I blinked. "What? If they were going to attempt oversight, they should have waited until control transferred to you. Filing before full authority activates raises motive questions." Her voice was calm, almost clinical. For the first time since that night at 9:17, I felt something shift. Not relief. Leverage. She walked me through the mechanics of temporary protective oversight. If granted quickly, especially without full contest, it could freeze my authority before I formally responded. Once installed, reversing it would require proof of fraud, coercion, or bad faith. "Do you believe the consent document is authentic?" she asked. "No." She studied the copy carefully. "The signature looks layered. See the pixel density around the curves. It's slightly inconsistent. My pulse steadied instead of racing. I signed a tax form weeks before that, I said. He handed it to me at the kitchen counter. Margaret nodded slowly. We'll subpoena the drafting firm's metadata logs. Then she asked a question I hadn't fully considered. Has any trust liquidity been repositioned recently? I frowned. Repositioned how? Transferred into an affiliated investment vehicle. Sometimes people move assets before oversight becomes official. It complicates reversal. We requested immediate transaction records from the trust custodian. By late afternoon, a preliminary review showed something buried under neutral language. Temporary liquidity repositioning. 3 weeks earlier, a portion of trust-held capital had been moved into a private fintech growth fund. The managing entity of that fund was a subsidiary partially owned by Nathan's company. I stared at the document. He hadn't just planned to manage my inheritance. He had already begun redirecting it. This is self-dealing territory, Margaret said quietly. If he influenced that move while simultaneously filing to question your capacity, it establishes coordinated intent. Coordinated intent. The words felt heavier than betrayal. We dug deeper. The fintech fund's recent performance reports showed underwhelming returns over the past 2 quarters. Investor notes referenced anticipated capital reinforcement through family alignment. Family alignment. I almost laughed. That alignment was me, I said. Margaret didn't smile. It was your liquidity. She reviewed the affidavit Nathan had submitted in support of the oversight petition. It referenced observable stress episodes, difficulty making financial decisions, and informal commentary from my primary care physician. My physician, a longtime golf partner of my father. They're building a narrative, Margaret said. If you resist too aggressively, they'll frame that resistance as instability. The strategy became clear in my mind. Create doubt, file early, position themselves as protectors. Margaret laid out our response. We would file a formal objection to the petition. Demand forensic handwriting analysis. Subpoena digital metadata. Freeze further trust transfers pending investigation. Timing determines leverage, she said. Right now, you still have some. I forwarded her the sign-in sheet from the Monarch Crown and the notarization confirmation Olivia had preserved. The timestamp of notarization matched the creation window of the suspicious consent document. And you were physically in Scottsdale that day? Margaret asked. Yes. I have receipts. Card transactions. Location data. That contradiction alone strengthens your fraud claim. We ran a background check on the fintech fund that received the trust capital. Underperformance. Pressure from investors. My father listed as an advisory consultant. The overlap wasn't coincidence anymore. It was structure. That evening, Nathan came home earlier than expected. He kissed my cheek like he always did, as if nothing had shifted beneath our feet. How was Phoenix? He asked casually. Productive, I said. He loosened his tie. Good. I met with counsel, I added. The pause lasted less than a second, but I saw it. Not fear. Calculation. You didn't need to escalate this, he said carefully. We could have handled it privately. If everything is legitimate, I replied evenly. The court will confirm that. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Dragging lawyers into this damages relationships, he said. Forging signatures damages them more. He didn't answer. Late that night, Margaret called. The court has temporarily paused review of the oversight petition, she said. Pending authenticity investigation. The judge assigned to the case had a reputation for zero tolerance toward fiduciary misconduct. I stood in the kitchen in the dark, phone pressed to my ear. For the first time since that phone call from Olivia, I felt something close to balance. Nathan thought he was managing my future. He didn't realize I had just started managing him. The courtroom felt colder than I expected. Nathan was already seated when I walked in with Margaret, my father beside him. Both of them dressed in the kind of calm confidence that only comes from believing you're prepared. I took my seat without looking at either of them. This was no longer a family discussion. This was record. The emergency evidentiary hearing began with Nathan's attorney framing the petition as protective. He spoke about volatility, about the burden of high-value inheritance, about my supposed emotional strain over the past year. He used phrases like temporary safeguard and family stability. My father testified next. He said he was acting out of paternal duty, that the family business could be destabilized if I mismanaged trust assets, that he loved me too much to let that happen. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Then they introduced the printed consent. My name at the bottom. My signature. Proof. They claimed that I had initially agreed to temporary oversight. Margaret stood. She did not raise her voice. She asked the court to consider preliminary forensic findings indicating digital manipulation in the signature layer. She referenced inconsistencies in pixel density and structural stroke patterns. Nathan's attorney objected, calling it speculative. Margaret responded by presenting the metadata timeline. The consent file had been created 12 days after the date printed beside my signature. The judge leaned forward. Margaret continued. She presented credit card records and location data, confirming I was physically in Scottsdale at the exact hour the document was notarized in Phoenix. The notary log from the Monarch Crown confirmed a document referencing my name was stamped inside the presidential villa that evening. The judge turned to Nathan. Who provided the document for notarization? He asked. Nathan hesitated. His attorney stepped in quickly, suggesting administrative miscommunication. The hesitation lingered in the air longer than the explanation. Margaret shifted the focus. She introduced evidence of the temporary liquidity repositioning. Trust capital had been moved into a private fintech growth fund partially controlled by Nathan's company. She displayed performance summaries showing the fund had underperformed projections in the last 2 quarters. My father's name appeared in the advisory section of the fund's documentation. The judge's expression hardened. Was the oversight petition filed before or after these transfers? He asked. After, Margaret said clearly. And who initiated the transfer? The silence this time was heavier. Nathan's attorney attempted to frame it as routine diversification. Margaret countered with corporate ownership charts indicating indirect financial benefit through subsidiary distributions. She used a word that changed the room. Self-dealing. Nathan shifted in his seat for the first time. The judge addressed him directly. Did you benefit, directly or indirectly, from the repositioned trust assets? No, Nathan said. Margaret slid a document forward. An internal investor memo referencing anticipated capital reinforcement through family alignment. The judge requested immediate disclosure of all related party transactions tied to the trust within the last 6 months. The balance shifted visibly. The oversight petition was no longer about my emotional capacity. It was about coordinated control. After a brief recess, the judge returned with a decision. The court denied immediate temporary oversight. A formal forensic audit would proceed regarding the authenticity of the consent document. All further trust asset transfers were frozen pending investigation. The hearing would reconvene once audit results were submitted. Nathan's attorney leaned in and whispered urgently to him. My father stared straight ahead. Outside the courtroom. In the hallway. My father tried to speak to me. This has gone too far, he said. Family reputation is at stake. Reputation isn't built on forged signatures. I replied. Nathan approached last. His voice was low. You're going to destroy everything, he said. Everything. The company, the investors, the family narrative. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing control. As I walked out of the courthouse into the Arizona sunlight, I felt something settle inside me. They had tried to prove I couldn't be trusted with my inheritance. Instead, they had just proven why I couldn't trust them. Margaret called just after sunrise. The forensic audit is complete, she said. You need to see this. I drove to her office without turning on the radio. She handed me a printed report the moment I sat down. The digital forensic team had examined the drafting firm's server history, version logs, and embedded file data. The consent document had been created 12 days after the date listed beside my signature. An earlier scanned copy of my tax form was stored in the same digital folder. A revision layer labeled Signature Overlay Draft appeared in the edit history. I read that phrase twice. Signature Overlay Draft. Not suspicion. Not theory. Instruction. Margaret slid another folder across the desk. Subpoenaed email correspondence between Nathan, my father, and the probate attorney. The subject lines were sterile. Strategic timing. Pre-transfer positioning. Capacity narrative. I opened the first thread. Nathan wrote, "We need to file before full beneficiary authority activates." My father replied, "If we wait until after her birthday, control becomes more complicated." Another message from Nathan. "Once oversight is in place, restructuring becomes easier." Restructuring. The word echoed differently now. I kept reading. They discussed the optics of my stress levels, how to document subtle concerns, how to phrase protective language without appearing aggressive. There was no anger in their emails, no hesitation, only planning. I leaned back in the chair and let the realization settle fully. My inheritance was not an afterthought in our marriage. It had been a variable in its design. Margaret's voice was steady. "This establishes coordinated intent. The petition was drafted months ago. Months. Before the villa meeting. Before the notarization. Before I even noticed the word capacity appearing in conversation." She pulled up financial disclosures next. Nathan's fintech company had missed key performance benchmarks in the last funding round. Investor confidence was thinning. Short-term liquidity pressure was evident in internal memos. One memo referenced anticipated capital reinforcement through family alignment. Family alignment. My trust. I remembered the night Nathan proposed. 6 months after he had first learned the projected value of my grandmother's estate. He had framed our future as a partnership built on shared ambition. Now that memory felt revised. That evening, I laid printed copies of the emails on the dining table before he came home. When Nathan walked in, he immediately sensed the shift. "What's this?" he asked. "Strategic timing," I said quietly. He scanned the pages, expression tightening. "You subpoenaed private correspondence," he said. "Yes." He exhaled slowly. "This is business planning. Lauren, it's not betrayal. You discussed filing before I turned 35. That's risk management. You discussed creating a capacity narrative. That's precaution. You discussed restructuring once oversight was in place. That's responsible governance." Every answer was framed as logic, never as confession. "Did you ever intend for me to control my inheritance?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. "You're safer when someone stronger handles volatility," he said instead. Stronger. The word landed like a verdict. So this was hierarchy, not partnership. I asked whether my father knew about the signature overlay. He hesitated just long enough. "He didn't handle documentation," Nathan said finally. Which meant he had... My phone rang. It was my father. He spoke quickly, almost defensively. "I never authorized forgery," he said. "Nathan managed the paperwork. Blame shifting. Minimizing. Shielding. You both discussed timing." I replied. "We were protecting the family name," he insisted. "The family name? Not my autonomy." After I hung up, Margaret called again. "The opposing probate attorney has filed a motion to withdraw," she said. "Likely due to exposure risk." Exposure. That was the word that frightened them. Not my emotions. Not our marriage. Exposure. Nathan stood across from me in the kitchen. "This will destroy the company," he said quietly. "Investors won't tolerate scandal. You destroyed it when you signed my name," I replied. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration finally cracking through his composure. "I was trying to protect us." "No," I said. "You were trying to position yourself." That night, after he moved into the guest room, I sat alone at the table with my laptop open. I drafted an email to Margaret instructing her to prepare divorce filings alongside fiduciary claims. Irreconcilable breach of trust. Marital asset review related to trust commingling. Emergency protective separation of finances. I read the words twice before hitting send. The house felt quiet again. Not fragile. Just clear. The man who checked into that luxury villa under a different name hadn't been hiding an affair. He had been hiding an agenda. The final hearing lasted less than 40 minutes. By then, the evidence was no longer theoretical. The forensic audit had been filed in full. The server logs from the drafting firm were entered into the record. The digital analysis confirmed that my signature had been extracted from the earlier tax document and layered onto the consent form using editing software. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He read aloud portions of the audit, including the revision history labeled Signature Overlay Draft. He noted that the consent document had been created days after the date printed beneath my name. He referenced the notarization log from the Monarch Crown, confirming that a document referencing me had been stamped in Phoenix while I was verifiably in Scottsdale. Nathan sat very still. My father stared straight ahead. The judge formally denied the petition for temporary protective oversight. He ordered that the forged consent be referred for further review and possible criminal investigation. He maintained the freeze on any related party transfers pending compliance audit. Then he used a phrase that changed everything. Apparent coordinated attempt to manipulate fiduciary authority. Coordinated. Attempt. Manipulate. Those words followed us out of the courtroom like a shadow. Within days, the fallout began. Nathan's company board initiated an internal governance review after learning that trust capital had been repositioned into the underperforming fintech fund. Investor calls turned sharp. Questions about related party transactions surfaced. My father's advisory role on the fund was quietly suspended. One major investor announced a temporary withdrawal pending clarification of governance practices. The narrative they had tried to build around my instability unraveled in the light of documented misconduct. Nathan came home one last time to talk. He stood in the living room, hands in his pockets, eyes tired but still calculating. "This didn't have to become public," he said. "We could have resolved it privately. You filed a petition questioning my capacity." I replied. "You created a document in my name. It was strategic," he said. "It was about protecting the structure." "What structure?" I asked. "The marriage or the money?" He didn't answer. I told him I had already filed for divorce. Irreconcilable breach of trust. Fiduciary misconduct. He closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing a loss in business rather than in love. "You're overreacting," he said softly. "No. I was reacting exactly enough. The trust administrator restored my full authority within the week. Administrative access returned. Transfer privileges unlocked. Oversight clauses removed pending further review. I replaced my father as temporary advisor with an independent fiduciary recommended by Margaret. Every investment vehicle tied to Nathan's company was separated from my portfolio. Under court supervision, the liquidity repositioning was reversed. The fintech fund lost its anticipated capital reinforcement. I walked through my house differently after that. Not as someone trying to preserve peace. As someone who had defended her own name. I thought back to that night at 9:17. The way Olivia had said Nathan's name like she was stepping around broken glass. The way he had smiled at the hotel desk under a different last name. Confident no one could trace him. He believed changing a name could hide intention. He forgot that documents leave trails. He forgot that systems record patterns. He forgot that I could read both. The criminal review into the forged consent remained ongoing. I didn't follow every update. I didn't need to. What mattered had already been decided. My inheritance remained intact. My legal standing remained intact. My autonomy remained intact. The marriage did not, and that was the only loss that no longer frightened me. Nathan once told me I was safer when someone stronger handled volatility. He never considered that strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes strength is quiet. Sometimes it's sitting in a courtroom while someone tries to question your capacity and letting the paperwork speak for you. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone. It's about refusing to let them rewrite you. If you've ever been told you were too emotional to handle your own money, if someone has ever tried to quietly take control in the name of protection, I hope this story reminds you to look at the documents, not just the tone of voice. Have you ever ignored a red flag because it came from someone you trusted? I would really like to know. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences matter more than you think. And if stories about hidden betrayal, financial power, and reclaiming control resonate with you, stay here. There are more stories like this. Stories where the truth doesn't shout, but it wins. Sometimes all it takes is one signature to change everything. Just make sure it's actually yours.